Shakamaku. How are you doing? Welcome to another Iraq Matters. I'm Julia Uriarte.
And I'm Taif Jani.
On this week's show, we ask the question, can Iraq's diverse communities ever live together peacefully?
For an answer, we turn to our special guest, Christine van der Toorn. Christine's an Iraq researcher who just completed 4 years on faculty at the American University in Iraq in Sulaymaniyah. She has been researching relations among the diverse communities that make up the northern Iraqi town of Bashiqa and other parts of Nineveh, and what it says about the prospects of peace in Iraq.
Following that conversation, we share some of Deputy Prime Minister Saleh al-Mutlaq and the top Sunni lawmaker Usama al-Najfi's recent remarks on the need for the U.S. to be more engaged in promoting national reconciliation in Iraq, particularly following the announced U.S. sale of Hellfire missiles and other weapons to Iraq.
And we end with an important update on the worst humanitarian catastrophe in a generation and what you can do to help.
But first, here's an Iraq update with Joel Wing. Hey Joel, thanks for coming to speak with us today on another edition of Iraq Matters. So, tell us what the latest updates are in Iraq. What's going on? What do you think we should know about?
There's a lot of things going on security-wise, economically, and politically. Obviously, the fighting is still going on in Anbar province. There's still militants in Fallujah and some of the surrounding cities. Baghdad is trying to have the locals in Anbar work out a deal where the militants will withdraw from some of the major cities and security can be imposed. I think the talks are going sort of off and on, and the Baghdad is threatening sending in the army into a place like Fallujah, which will probably be really bad, destruction of a lot of the city. So that's what's going on security-wise. Politically, there's a huge dispute going on between the central government and the Kurdistan regional government. Kurdistan recently completed its own independent and separate pipeline to the northern Kirkuk pipeline to Turkey. And it's talked about exporting oil directly to Turkey on its own. And Baghdad has always opposed this. So in the new draft 2014 budget, they're threatening to cut Kurdistan's share of the budget. They're supposed to get 17% each year, although when it works out, it's around 10%. So Maliki is threatening to cut their budget unless they stop exporting to Turkey and go officially through Baghdad. So that's a really big dispute going on with that. Also, the elections are coming up, obviously, this year in April, and so all the politicians are out campaigning. Maliki is, for example, going through a little tour of the South right now. And he's talking about terrorism and how he's standing up to it, obviously using Anbar as an example of how he can fight terrorism, even though he started it by going to Anbar and shutting down the protest site in Ramadi and trying to intimidate people there and arresting parliamentarian Alwani, who's one of the protest leaders. So that's what's going on in Iraq right now.
So, in November, Iraqi Prime Minister Maliki was in Washington to meet with President Obama. What appears to be the outcome of that visit?
Not much. I think he came to the United States to basically ask for aid with fighting the insurgency since it's taking off again. I mean, there's all kinds of other issues, but I think the main thing was speeding up the delivery of arms. Iraq has a huge amount, millions of dollars in arms purchases from the United States are being held up for a number of reasons. Basically, a lot of people in Congress are opposed to it. I think some congressmen think Iraq is controlled by Iran and they don't want to be seen as helping out Tehran, so they're holding up the arms sales. So he came here asking for military aid, and the Obama administration released some of it. They gave him some Hellfire missiles, they gave him some unarmed drones, and they talked about maybe giving some training and stuff like that. And these are all things that are already in the pipeline that Iraq already ordered. But then there's conflicting reports about how much more is going to come, but I think the main thing is he came here asking for help to fight the insurgency.
Earlier this month, Iraq's Deputy Prime Minister Saleh al-Mutlaq was in town. Last week, Iraq's top Sunni lawmaker Usama al-Najfi, the Speaker of the Parliament, was in town. What's behind these recent visits?
I think part of it is the upcoming elections. I think they're all trying to look for Washington support for the next vote, so they're hoping that the U.S. will back them in whatever kind of negotiations go on to form the next government. I think that's the main motivation.
All right, Joel. Thanks so much for coming to speak with us. That was Joel Wing with an Iraq update on another episode of Iraq Matters.
Hi, I'm Eric Gustafson, Today, I'm really pleased to introduce to you Christine van Toorn. Christine is a longtime researcher. She's lived in Iraq for over 4 years. One of the areas of her research has been the town of Bashiqa, a very diverse town that's just outside Mosul in northern Iraq. Bashiqa and its surrounding countryside fall within the province of Nineveh, which has a provincial council based in Mosul. The area is also contested by the federal government based in Baghdad and by the regional government of Kurdistan based in Erbil. Christine and I sat down to discuss Bashiqa's rich history and diversity and what it tells us about the prospects for peace in Iraq. Our interview begins with the story of how Bashiqa earned its nickname, Little Iraq.
People in Bashiqa call it a little Iraq because of its diversity. You have people that identify as Arab, a lot that identify as Kurd. You have Yazidis, you have Christians, you have Sunni Muslims. So it's mixed, as has the Iraqi state been historically. Another reason is because it's harmonious there. Whereas, of course, in Iraq, we've seen this quote-unquote sectarian war and politicians talking about sectarianism and antagonistic sectarian identity. That is not how Iraq was before. You had Sunni and Shia intermarrying and living in the same neighborhoods. So in Bashiqa, it is highly mixed and harmonious, and there's tolerance, and people don't fight Christians, Yazidis, Muslims are all best friends. They live in the same neighborhood. They go to the same schools. All the blocks in Bashiqa are mixed, so this represents Iraq historically. Unfortunately, we've seen this rise of antagonistic sectarian identities, but historically, Iraq was not like that. So Bashiqa is a picture of what Iraq is historically and what it can be again.
So describe just briefly the patchwork of communities that make up Bashiqa and the surrounding area.
So Bashiqa, the town center, which really matters the most, you have probably 75 to 80% Yazidi, and
Could
then
you give us a quick history on the Yazidi?
Oh yeah, so Yazidi claim to be the oldest religion in the world. They have been in these lands for centuries. I mean, they are the real original inhabitants of a lot of these parts of what is now Turkey, especially southeastern Turkey and northern Iraq. And, historically, most people will say, except when it's politically not acceptable, to say that all Kurds were Yazidis and all Yazidis were Kurds. So it's very important to understand that this religion is heavily tied into Kurdishness. Now, today, that's very different, obviously, because of all the conversions to Islam. Some people would dispute what I just said. We weren't Yazidi or this or that. But that is something that a lot of people would agree with. So it is a religion that's also heavily tied into Kurdish ethnicity, though the majority of Kurds today, of course, are Muslim. So in Bashiqa, you have, it's majority Yazidi. So Bashiqa is then probably 80% Yazidi, maybe 75. And then you have, 10, 15% Christian, about 10% Muslim. But then in the rural areas, you have 100,000 about, and 90% of those people are Shebek. And Shebek, you will find a different thing when you talk to a different person. Some say we're Sunni, some will say we are Persian, Shia, and some will say we are Kurdish. The identities are mixed there. So their origin is Persian, a lot of people will say, but Kurdish Persian. But some of them identify as Shia, some say we're Sunni. So it's very mixed.
So, and then there you have the Faili Kurds, which is a whole other category.
Yeah, a whole other category. And these are villagers. I mean, these are villages and farms that Shebek. And then also in Bashiqa's hinterlands, you have Christians, Kurds,
when you say Christians,
Arab tribes.
Are these like Chaldeans?
Chaldeans and Assyrians, yeah.
Okay.
Mostly, I'd say the majority are Assyrian. So you had this historically Iraqi town where people identify as Iraqi. They speak Arabic, but they're Yazidi. It's 30 kilometers from Mosul. You have Christians, Yazidis, and Muslims there. And there was no violence. And that was because, Bashiqa, people in Bashiqa are educated. They have good jobs. And it's a very tightly knit community. They would never fight each other. It is highly integrated. The Christians and the Muslims and the Yazidis all live on the same streets. They're all friends. Yeah. So it was very interesting to me that there hadn't been any violence in a city that was so diverse, so close to Mosul, that has had so much violence, especially in terms of targeting Yazidis and Christians.
And tell us a little bit, if we think more broadly in terms of the entire province of Nineveh, and where you do have this green line that is the KRG administered area, but then you have the Iraqi government administered area. and then Mosul being really a flashpoint of a lot of violence. Why have those dynamics been there? Is it just a matter of the disputed territories between Kurdistan and the central government, or is there more going on there that's driving violence?
I think that there's been very little, at least since 2008, in Sinjar and Sheikhan and Bashiqa, in these disputed territories in Nineveh, outside Mosul. There has not been, I would say, that traditional violence, like Al-Qaeda, these extremist groups. There were a lot of attacks on Yazidis and Christians in Mosul and in these areas in the real bad years, 5, 6, 7.
I mean, so
that
one of the worst terrorist attacks
in Sinjar,
in terms of loss of life, happened in Sinjar, and this was against a Yazidi village. How many? I mean, it was hundreds.
Almost 700 died.
700 died in the bombing.
Hundreds of injuries. And that, for example, 23 workers from Bashiqa were executed on a bus going back. They were working in Mosul. They were returning back to Bashiqa. Mm-hmm. These are huge losses for a Yazidi community because there's so few Yazidis. And that really, when I was talking about earlier, that really cut Yazidi communities off from Mosul. There are still people going to university and this and that, but people are interacting far more with Dohuk and Erbil. People are very scared to go. They used to love Mosul. They loved it. They traded there. They went shopping there. They went to eat there. They went to school there. And that has stopped almost totally.
What have been some of the drivers of violence?
Yeah,
in
I
Mosul
think,
especially.
Of course, like I was saying, you have that traditional, Al-Qaeda targeting minority religious groups. But you really don't see that too much anymore. The violence has really been limited. What you see now more are, and I don't think this will ever end in fighting, but you do see a lot of demographic shifts. A lot of Yazidis and Christians are leaving, which means what they call the Muslims. They say more Muslims are coming to town. These are Kurds. Okay, the Christians and Yazidis are minorities. They're leaving. They're going to the cities, and they're also going to Europe. A lot are going to Europe. And this leaves space for Kurds from further east and Dohuk to come and settle in Sheikhan, in Sinjar, in Bashiqa. So this also serves the KRG's agenda of making these areas part of the KRG, these disputed territories. And this has caused problems, conflicts in places like Bartella, which is near Bashiqa, which is majority Christian, but now you have a lot of new groups moving in. That's caused tensions. But, you just hear people talk about it. Nothing's probably going to happen, but these demographic shifts are, important to watch. Because Yazidis and Christians, this was their land. Nineveh was their land. So, for example, while the large majority of Yazidis are aligned with the KDP or members of the KDP, and to a lesser extent the PUK, you do have, I would say, I've been told 10-15% of the Yazidi population, particularly in Sinjar, that are in parties that are against the Kurdish occupation of Nineveh, and they are pro-Baghdad. The Yazidi quota seat on the Nineveh Council is a pro-Baghdad, anti-KRG candidate, as well as the Yazidi quota in Baghdad. So there are groups that are not aligned with the KRG. And this reflects the varying, diverse identities among Yazidis. Some will say we're Kurds, some will say we're kind of Kurds, or we were Kurds, or we're Kurds culturally, or we're Kurds politically. So it's not, a Kurd from Rania is different than a Yazidi Kurd.
You mentioned Bashiqa and Sinjar, but
yeah, in terms of Sheikhan, Sheikhan is a little bit more of a clear-cut case in terms of disputed territory because it really is more Kurdish. Geographically, it's closer to the KRG, to the Green Line. There are less affiliation with Mosul. It's further from Mosul geographically and Iraq. And it was almost totally Yazidi, but now a lot of Yazidis have left, and there were many more Christians, but now also a lot of Christians have left. And there are, so therefore, a large number of, they call them again Muslims, but Kurds moving in to take that land and to buy those homes. So it's just another interesting case of these places. You think of them all as the same. Oh, they're Yazidi, they're Christian, they're Kurdish, this and that. But there are very local identities and local dynamics. And this all came out in the elections. Yazidis or Kurdish Yazidis won 7 seats on the Nineveh Provincial Council through the Kurdistan list. The Kurdistan list won 11 seats. 7 of those were Yazidis or Yazidi Kurds.
Interesting.
So they thought they should have won more. I mean, it's hard to imagine how non-Yazidis won 4 of those seats, quite frankly. And candidates from like 1 or 2 from Sheikhan, 2 from Sinjar, 2 from Bashiqa won. So they're going to have way more representation, these groups, on the council than before, when also the Kurds withdrew from the council over the past few years. So, and also the Kurdistan list has 2 leadership roles now in the Nineveh Council. So, it's a relative win to what happened before in 2009. Now they'd had no leadership before, now they have 2. And they have a similar amount of seats, but if they don't withdraw, they will actually be there and therefore have more of a say. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes bargaining between Nujafi, Athil Nujafi, and between the Kurds. And
Nujafi is is the governor.
Right, is the governor for a second term. Ran on Mutahidun list, which is the same as his brother, Osama Nujafi, the speaker.
Historically, just thinking about Bashiqa and thinking about the political changes that Iraq has gone through, so what was it like in the early days of the Republic of Iraq, like right after the overthrow of the monarchy in 1958? What were the politics of Bashiqa then, and what were the politics under the Ba'ath, and what are the politics now?
Yeah, I mean, and the politics of Bashiqa reflect the politics of the Iraqi state historically. Everyone in Bashiqa was a communist when the Communist Party was big in the late 50s, 60s. Then everyone was in the Ba'ath Party when most people in Iraq were in the Ba'ath. That I'm not saying anything about loyalty to the Ba'ath or loyalty to the communists. And now everyone is in maybe one of the Kurdistan regional government's parties or one of the parties out of Mosul. So, they shift. They're part of one guy, almost everyone was a communist and then they were a Ba'athist and now they're in the KDP or, a party out of Mosul, not quite as much now. So, but, these political parties never affect society. They don't affect social relationships. Someone was a Ba'athist, they would always tell the communists when the Baathists were coming for a raid. So these political affiliations do not affect social harmony. And that is how I think all Iraqis feel. And I think, of course, you've had this politicization and this increased antagonistic language of sectarianism. But if you talk to Iraqis, just like you talk to people in Bashiqa, they don't really care about these things as much as they care about their neighbors.
Interesting. So it really does tell us a lot about what's possible, that peace is possible among Iraq's diverse communities.
That's right, because that's how it was historically. There's precedent for that.
A lot has happened over the past year. For the countrywide, it's been one of the worst years in terms of violence since, I think, 2008. Can you give us a little bit of an update? How has that increase in violence affected relations in places like Bashiqa, or more widely in Nineveh province?
Sure. In Bashiqa, people continue to live harmoniously. That said, over the past few months, there has been a huge increase in violence in Mosul, especially with Al-Qaeda and this new ISIS, this Daesh group, targeting government officials and local government characters like the mayors and the Mukhtars, prison guards, police. So also with that, you've had more and increased threats against minority students that might attend Mosul University that are from Sinjar and Bashiqa and Sheikhan.
So in closing, another question we ask all of our guests: why does Iraq matter?
Iraq matters because historically it really was a center of the Middle East, and it could be again. And in the past, it was an educated center. In Baghdad University and Mosul University, these were 2 of the greatest universities in the region. And it can be that again. There is history. There's precedent for that. So, in the beginning, with this whole invasion, the idea was to build this democracy in Iraq, and therefore it would influence all other countries in the region to do that. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying it matters because it could be what it was before. These identities, this sectarianism that's become salient and antagonistic, that's not historic in Iraq. So it's not like it's always been like that, and these Sunni and Shia have always hated each other. Iraqis are secular and educated, so there's precedent for that to come back through education. But first we need stability and peace.
Yeah.
But, these educated students can be actors and participants in creating that peace. And you have these progressive secular elements in Baghdad, students that are now they see the Shia. It's going to be hard to unseat, but they see these religious parties as, some of them as having failed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because look at Iraq right now.
Yeah.
So can we, down the road, I'm not saying next year or in 2 years, do we see maybe then room in the future for a return of a Baghdad that was more like the 50s and 60s and 70s?
Iraqi Deputy Prime Minister Saleh al-Mutlaq visited Washington, D.C. this month, where he talked about the future of Iraq in light of the upcoming elections. As Eli Lake from the Daily Beast reported, Mr. Mutlaq requested that the U.S. provide election monitors for the upcoming elections in order to ensure their legitimacy. Mr. Mutlaq continued to call for free and fair elections during his remarks.
Iraqia was supposed to take the chance to form the government because it won 91 seats against the 89 seats. But because of the pressure from Iran and because the United States did not act in a strong way, things went in a wrong way. And in my feeling, without finding a national project, a national list, a national coalition, which will be away from sectarianism, this country will not be stabilized, and it will not be kept united.
He warned against the dangers of sectarian politics.
Sectarianism is not among the Iraqis. Sectarianism is among the politicians, but they can use it to agitate people by creating some problems at a specific time, just before the election, to move the people emotionally towards a specific line.
He also talked about the need for political stability within the nation.
It is a must now that we should create the stability. If we create the stability, we'll find development. We will find jobs for the people. But if not, this will continue, and even if we defeat al-Qaeda in that place, then maybe we'll face al-Qaeda somewhere else. We need a complete solution, a solution in which all the Iraqis will gather together by gathering their politicians. And the problem is not within the Iraqis themselves. The problem is between the politicians of Iraq.
Mr. Mutlaq warned against a policy focused solely on military aid, calling for a more balanced plan of action.
Sale of weapons in parallel with the reconciliation. Because again, I don't think the weapons alone can solve the problem. The major problem is that there is no reconciliation in the country. If there is a reconciliation, maybe we need weapon, but the weapon we need may be much less than what we need now. So these two things has to go together. Do not concentrate on one aspect and leave the other aspect. I think you have a legal and moral responsibility towards Iraq, because Iraq was a united country. You came to remove Saddam Hussein regime, a dictatorship regime, towards democracy. And in fact, instead of doing that, you destroyed a country.
He called on the United States and the rest of the international community to live up to what he called their moral obligations and play a larger role in helping Iraq rebuild.
Iraq, in my opinion, will stand up at some time and get rid of what's going on now. But what is needed from you and from the world in general is to help Iraq to stand as soon as possible, in a shorter time. And again, I feel it is the responsibility of the world who decided to invade Iraq at that time, to stand for Iraq and help Iraq in such a moment.
Osama Najafi, top Sunni lawmaker and Speaker of the Iraqi Council of Representatives, was also in Washington last week. Najafi spoke at the Brookings Institute, moderated by Kenneth Pollack of Brookings Saban Center. Speaking through a translator, Mr. Najafi began with remarks on the state of Iraq's democracy.
We in Iraq went through a very particular experience in the Middle East. We first get rid of an oppressive regime, and it was followed by a military occupation, then a constitution that was written in unstable conditions and circumstances. There was also a roadmap that was set, but the Iraqis were not able to contribute to this roadmap because we were in a rush, and we wanted Iraq to be an exemplary democracy.
He also spoke of what he saw as the United States' role in supporting stability in Iraq and his vision of a respectful friendship between the two nations.
Iraq. And therefore, I believe the Americans can play a very important role in bringing the parties closer together in Iraq and in supporting Iraq in its fight against al-Qaeda, in providing the necessary expertise to encourage national reconciliation and try to restore the cohesion in Iraq. And we do know that Iraq has very important relations with other countries. Iran has an influence, Turkey has an influence, Arab countries have an influence. As a superpower, the United States has an influence over all the countries in the Middle East. And Iraq needs a long-term friendship with the United States. A friendship, though, based on the values of democracy and the respect of human rights and a stable, successful state. Not a state that is working outside legitimacy and with discrimination and oppression.
In response to a question regarding the upcoming elections in Iraq, Mr. Najafi emphasized the importance of these elections as a crossroads determining the future success or instability in Iraq.
We should avoid political provocation. We should avoid confessional mobilization in order to be able to organize fair and just elections that can provide a solution to the Iraqi problem. If we do not have such circumstances, if we do not have international observers, and the United States should be present through observers, as should the United Nations and all countries, if we do not have all this, the elections can be very destructive. So this is a historic chance, and it is a crossroad between either stability or, God forbid, between other and more intricate problems.
Links to the full version of these talks can be found on EPIC's blog. Hi, this is Taif with a humanitarian update. 2013 was a catastrophic year for Syria and Iraq. The UN reports more than 8,800 Iraqis lost their lives in the worst violence since 2008. The war in Syria claimed even more lives, bringing the death toll of Syria's civil war to more than 100,000. Right now, there are ongoing reports of areas in northern Syria and western Iraq that have fallen under the black flags of al-Qaeda, although local residents are fighting back. Some 9 million Syrians have been forced to flee their homes, while more than 3.5 million Iraqis remain displaced. Due to increased violence in western Iraq, particularly in and around Fallujah and Ramadi, the UNHCR reports that approximately 140,000 people were forced to flee Anbar province since the end of last year. Waves of bombings continue to take countless lives. With winter temperatures dropping below zero, aid agencies are struggling to meet the humanitarian needs of those recently displaced by violence, along with millions of refugees across the region. Combined, the total number of displaced Syrians and Iraqis in the region exceeds 12.5 million, according to UN estimates, easily making it the worst humanitarian catastrophe of the 21st century. At a recent donors conference in Kuwait, the UN made an appeal for $6.5 billion to aid Syrian refugees. This is a record-breaking appeal. Last year, nations participating in the donors conference pledged $1.5 billion, with only 75% of that money being delivered. How can you help? The organization behind this podcast, the Education for Peace in Iraq Center, also known as EPIC, is hosting a petition on change.org, urging President Obama and Congress to support a long-term strategy for peace in Iraq by supporting Iraqis through U.S. aid projects and working with internal groups to include minorities. That petition now has 8,246 signatures. Our goal is 10,000.
On behalf of EPIC, we would like to thank Joel and Christine for joining us on this week's episode. If you have a story to tell, a comment to share, a burning question you need an answer to, or if you read an interesting book on Iraq that you think others should know about, send us an email or tweet using the hashtag IraqMatters. As always, you can find us on Facebook. One more thing before we go, help us grow our audience by voting for us on Podcast Land by searching for Iraq Matters, and help us reach a wider audience. This is Julia Uriarte reminding you that Iraq matters.